a cross between Breath of the Wild and Tomb Raider. That is apparently what the next game from Eidos-Montréal is going to be. They are the most recent Deus Ex developer, so they produced Human Revolution, Mankind Divided. They've released some other games. The most recent was the Guardians of the Galaxy game from 2021. Pretty well received, maybe not what I was hoping for from them, but it did prove that they're one of the few developers out there who can release a genuinely good quality AAA single-player game. So anything that they are working on, I'm going to be thinking about it. I'm going to be considering buying it. So I've got high hopes for the new IP that I will talk about, but also the new Deus Ex game that they may have in the works, and we'll chat about that too. The new IP, there's been some leaks on their website, job listings, and people online pasted some of those together, and it's sounding like the new game that Eidos-Montréal is working on. It is likely an ancient history, maybe post-apocalyptic setting. It's very much going to be open world, and it's sounding like outside those comparisons I mentioned, Breath of the Wild, Tomb Raider, there might be a bit of Horizon Zero Dawn thrown in there. I will say, while I think they're going to produce something good, it's a little bit disappointing to me that they're working on something that sounds generic. If we talk about open world, maybe post-apocalyptic, 3D sort of running around puzzles, it doesn't sound super unique. We have gotten a lot of those games over the years. I think there's even a little bit of oversaturation. People have just had enough. In the PS4, sort of Xbox One era, we got so many of these open world games that on the PS5 and so on, the same sorts of games kept coming out, and I feel like some gamers have had enough, which is why unique titles like, say, the Resident Evil remake series, Baldur's Gate 3, these RPGs that we're getting as well, people are not minding getting either linear games or titles in different genres where they have to actually engage with gameplay in a different way. People have had enough with towers in Ubisoft games, running around collecting everything, stories that feel really safe and by the numbers. It's just not super exciting. So what we're seeing from these job listings is that Eidos-Montréal's next game may be this. One of the issues with game development is that games take so long to produce that maybe 4 or 5 years when they started working on this title, it did sound like what the market wanted. But 5 years on, we get to 2023 and maybe it's not. That's me looking at it pessimistically, that it could be some sort of generic open world title. But I do want to give them the benefit of the doubt. As I said, I think regardless of what it is, it's going to be well made, because Eidos-Montréal, they haven't really released a bad game when it comes to what they've developed themselves. They were partly responsible for Marvel's Avengers in 2020, which no one liked. It wasn't very well made. It felt like it was rushed out the door. But keep in mind that they used to be owned by Square Enix, who have treated their Western developers historically pretty poorly. They obviously sold them off not long ago to Embracer Group. Embracer Group being the huge organisation. They were known as THQ Nordic, who bought up every single IP and then seemed to be going bankrupt, or things aren't going very well anymore. We've seen studios from them close. It's not good. But to come back to Eidos-Montréal, it seems like the Avengers game was rushed out the door, and it was another example of a single-player focused developer releasing a title that wasn't really in their sphere. It was a live service game. That's not their strength. A bit like Redfall from Arcane. That wasn't really what they were known for doing. They weren't focusing on what they could really produce. So I don't really hold that against Eidos-Montréal. I do think that when they release a game in their wheelhouse, Guardians of the Galaxy, again, not a title I was really wanting from them, but still a very well-made game that people seem to like. They have not produced anything that I think is genuinely rubbish. The closest might be Thief 2014, which was middling, not super great, but still not bad, and probably not bad in comparison to some of what we do get these days, I suppose. The new title Eidos are working on, the job listings do refer to villages, they refer to 3D puzzles, and it does make me think about what could be included there, because I don't think it's going to be as generic as, say, one of the more recent Assassin's Creed games. I don't think they would just copy and paste that structure. I think that they'll take their experience from Tomb Raider. They worked on the third Tomb Raider, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, I believe it was called, but they didn't work on the first two. I have a feeling that they were maybe pushed, again by Square Enix, the publisher, to work on a Tomb Raider game because they were more profitable than something like Deus Ex. And they might have been pushed in that direction. I think Shadow of the Tomb Raider, people felt it was a little underwhelming compared to the first two. And again, I think it's because Eidos were working on a title that they weren't super familiar with. It wasn't completely to their strengths like Deus Ex. But it was still a pretty good game. And they might have taken their experience from Tomb Raider, and maybe they're looking to apply it to their experience with other titles. Maybe Deus Ex, who knows, with this IP. So what I might think is it'll have that open world, third person sort of vibe, but the actual content you do within, I don't think it's going to be climbing Ubisoft towers. It sounds like there's going to be actual puzzle dungeons within. That's kind of where that Breath of the Wild comparison comes in. And I'm sure there's a bit of Tomb Raider thrown in as well. Actual puzzles that you need to solve, hopefully within the world as well. I'd like to see the world be quite dynamic. Solve puzzles in the world, solve them in dungeons, but just really engaging gameplay. I imagine it will be some sort of RPG to some extent. It's been a while since Eidos-Montréal has worked on a full-fledged RPG, as I consider Deus Ex to kind of be that sort of immersive sim. I think there's going to be some more of that, but we are going to have to wait and see. For now, it's more guessing. It's really just thinking of predictions of what we're going to get, but we know it's in full swing. What we have also picked up, so before these job listing leaks, Jason Schreier, he's a bit of an industry insider. What he comes out with is usually accurate, at least. And a little while ago, a year or two ago, he mentioned that Eidos-Montréal were working on 3 different projects. And what he was referring to was the new IP, which is this that we're discussing now, a new Deus Ex game. To me, that's probably the most exciting piece of news. When I heard that a while back, I was pumped, and I was keen to find out how their development overall was progressing so we could get to the Deus Ex game. That's what I was really keen on. So that was coming, but apparently we're still ages away. The third was helping Xbox out with projects like Fable. And I mean, Microsoft can just keep doing what they're doing. I don't really care, but I would really like to see Eidos-Montréal focus on their own games. That, to me, is most important. Even if the Microsoft stuff, it probably guarantees that the bills are paid. And given Eidos are owned by Embracer Group, I'm sure they want all these bills paid. Things aren't going well for them. So whatever. When it comes to Eidos, I don't think that they're a studio that works on just one game and then moves on to the next one. Having a look at all of the titles that they've developed, we got Human Revolution in 2011, their first game. That is a pretty good first outing, I've got to say. That was a really, really nice game. And that's where they really started. They then moved on to Thief 2014. I mentioned that was a little bit middling, but it only came out 3 years later. I'm not convinced that they released that and developed that within 3 years. I have a feeling that what happens with them, because Mankind Divided came out in 2016, only 2 years after Thief, so quite a few games in a short span time, at least, when it comes to modern development. What I think happens is they'll work on a project in full swing, and then at some point, part of the team will start building the next game. And while that might mean the game that they're in full swing on doesn't release as quickly as it could, it makes sure that they don't have huge gaps between games, because that has been a theme. Mankind Divided came out in 2016, but then they released Shadow of the Tomb Raider only a couple of years later, and we then got the Marvel's Avenger game, again, rubbish, but it only came out in 2020, so it's not as if Eidos sat there for 6 years or something, twiddling their thumbs, released a pile of junk like happened with BioWare and Anthem. So it seems like they're quite smart, maybe their management is pretty in tune, and it ensures that they're releasing games pretty regularly, even if they don't necessarily have multiple dedicated development teams. I looked into that, I couldn't find any evidence that they actually have separate teams, so it seems like it may just be pretty good management, and that has led to most of their games being pretty good, if the publishers don't totally meddle with them, which again happened with the Avengers. So it really does seem like they're one of those current studios, like a Larian for instance, who can just release quality titles. They're still capable of it. So I have hopes for Deus Ex, I have hopes for the new IP. I'd really like to see that new IP release over the next year or two. They don't release games really far apart, as I've said, so it would make sense for the new IP to actually come out next year, maybe the following year at the latest. Now, I have spoken about job listings today, so that's sort of how this info came about. That's probably the only concern there. If they're still hiring, for instance, lead-level designers, it's hard to say if that means the game isn't in super heavy development, if they're sort of getting to that stage now. I hope maybe someone has moved on for whatever reason. Hopefully not because the game's in trouble, but for some other reason, and they're filling the position. I'd feel better about that. If they're only really getting into full production now, I couldn't see this game releasing for a couple of years, which to me would be a problem. I hate seeing situations where quality developers have these big hiatuses and you don't really know why. It's happened with Retro Studios for Nintendo. They released Tropical Freeze in, I think it was 2013, and then they did nothing for 10 plus years. We haven't even got their real next game, Metroid Prime 4 yet. So it's been a long time. You know something must have happened behind the curtains. It's the same for Rocksteady. They released Arkham Knight. Decent game. Not everyone loved it, but I still think pretty well made. But then they've taken 8 years to come out with potentially Suicide Squad next year, and it looks absolutely generic. That looks like studio meddling. If ever there was an example of that, it's really sad to see. So with Eidos, I think a concern some people had, and it's why I brought up Embracer Group earlier, is the worry that with Embracer closing a lot of studios, that's what they've been doing. Embracer, they lost a ton of money after a big deal, billion-dollar deal fell through, and that ended them going on a buying spree of these sort of AA, lower, I suppose, lesser known IPs, and suddenly sort of knuckling down and go, okay, we actually have to produce something that sells now. We can't just keep buying things. The economy probably played a part, but that's basically what happened. There was some concern that they were going to close Eidos-Montréal. That's not necessarily a rumour, but just a concern that floated around. I would say it's unlikely because of how consistent Eidos have been. They haven't been like the Saints Row studio, where they've been releasing dud after a dud and appeared to be on their last legs. You close Eidos, and I feel like you just close a studio that can actually produce, unlike a lot of the Embracer Group studios that are probably a bit mixed. They haven't really had big juggernaut, well-selling titles. So I hope to think that Eidos is safe. They're obviously hiring, they're hard at work on these games, and hopefully that means we get them. I'd really like to see the new IP release next year, and for Deus Ex to maybe be 2 or 3 years later. I still think, unfortunately, we're looking at a 2026 at the earliest, 27 release for Deus Ex, but it is something to get excited about. I mean, the series itself has been fairly consistent. It's not often that you get an original classic, you get rebooted titles in the series, and they're really good as well. That seems really rare. So Eidos did a good job there. The Adam Jensen story, I'd love to see it continue, but I have a feeling it's going to be a brand new reboot. I really don't think they're going to sort of bring that back up. The whole thing with the Deus Ex Mankind Divided game and the Adam Jensen series of games was that Square Enix meddled. They forced Eidos to release half a game, essentially, in Mankind Divided, at least story-wise. It just felt like that game was undercooked. It ended just as it was getting started. And since then, nothing happened. The sales weren't great, which was probably word-of-mouth related, because people went around saying, hey, there's half a story here. Maybe don't buy the game at full price, because you're not going to get all of it. It feels like Square Enix wanted Eidos to save the rest for later, which didn't feel good. But anyway, that caused the series to go on ice. And now it's probably just in limbo. I think if we get a conclusion to the Adam Jensen storyline in a rebooted Deus Ex, it's probably going to come as some sort of side quest. I could see Adam Jensen maybe being an NPC, maybe being someone you interact with, but I'd be very surprised if he's the main character. I have a feeling that they're going to start from scratch. And who really knows if the developers behind the original, at least the rebooted original Deus Ex titles, are still there. We hear all the time with Arcane, for instance, with Redfall, that the actual people behind the classic titles the studios are known for, they eventually move on. If you start mucking around with them, I imagine, like with the Marvel's Avengers games, the Eidos developers who were working on that probably weren't super happy. They went from immersive sims to some sort of live service generic cash grab title. And the talented ones probably did move on. Just like with Arcane and Redfall, the developers have moved on. So they're often studios in names only. And I hope that's not the case with Eidos. That's why I do mention that they're still releasing good games, because the consistency still seems to be there. It's just a question of if they can apply that to RPGs. So the new title, the new IP, I hope we get more news soon. I'm going to be sort of checking it out. Anything that we do find out, I certainly want to talk about. And I hope it leads us to getting a quality Deus Ex game, because how this new IP pans out, that is probably going to tell us, do they still have what it takes? They do so far, but you're only as good as your next game, let's be honest. So we'll see what happens. But thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.